Robbers attacked an elderly woman, but they had no idea she wasn't alone. Her bear was. The wind slithered through the tall pines like a ghost with unfinished business, its breath sharp with snow and secrets. Eleanor Ellie Hayes stood at the edge of her weathered porch, a steaming mug cradled in her arthritic hands. Her eyes, gray and distant like storm clouds, swept across the snow-covered forest of Northridge, Oregon, a realm both sanctuary and prison. Somewhere in those woods, her daughter had walked for the last time, chasing truths too dangerous to be left buried. Now, 3 winters later, Ellie lived alone in the same cabin where Claire had once laughed, sketched geological cross-sections by the fire, and mapped the veins of Greystone Falls as if trying to chart the heart of the world. The fire inside crackled, the old kettle beginning to sing, but Ellie lingered. The stillness of the woods always came before something. She could feel it in her bones. The earth held its breath, and so did she. Finally, retreating inside, she closed the heavy wooden door and bolted it out of habit more than fear. Her days were as fixed as the seasons now. Tea at dawn, chopping wood by mid-morning, reading her daughter's notes in the evening, lit by the same lamp Claire once used. She had stopped expecting visitors, stopped hoping for closure, but not for answers. She still wanted those. The cabin was small, cluttered with the memories of a family long dissolved. Photographs lined the mantel. Claire with her sun hat askew, her husband Thomas grinning behind her. Both gone. The authorities had called it a tragic accident. Ice on the road, loss of control, a sharp turn, a long fall, case closed. But Ellie, stubborn as the oaks outside, had never accepted the story. Claire had been too careful. She wasn't just a geologist. She was a protector of the land, a whistleblower in the making. Before her death, Claire had submitted reports detailing unauthorized drilling beneath Greystone Falls, a protected zone, sacred to the watershed and dangerous if destabilized. She'd told Ellie on the phone weeks before the crash, "If something happens to me, don't trust the easy explanations." Ellie sipped her tea, the bitterness lingering on her tongue. Outside, twilight thickened like smoke, the sky bleeding lavender and steel. She placed another log on the fire, coaxing warmth into the bones of the old cabin. The wind had picked up, its pitch shifting from whisper to warning. Then suddenly it came, a sharp crack. Not from the forest, but much closer. A gunshot. The mug slipped from Ellie's hand and shattered against the hearth. The sound echoed, unnatural, slicing through the quiet like a knife. Her breath caught. Another sound, a crunch in the snow, deliberate, heavy. Footsteps. She moved on instinct, heart hammering like a war drum, and dropped to her knees. Crawling toward the kitchen, she reached the old drawer by muscle memory. Her fingers closed around the revolver, untouched since her husband's funeral. Its cold weight settled in her palm like a verdict. More footsteps. Someone tested the back door. The handle turned, then rattled harder. Locked for now. Ellie slipped beneath the heavy oak table, its legs thick enough to hide her small frame. Shadows from the fire danced along the floor. The door creaked under pressure, metal against wood. Her pulse screamed in her ears, and then, movement beside her. Large, slow, familiar. A low breath, warm against her cheek. Bruno. He had come. She turned her head, and there he was, massive, silent, his brown fur dusted with snow, his black eyes calm and steady as stone. He'd aged since she first saw him limping through the meadow years ago, a cruel trap mangling his hind leg. Ellie had nursed him, not out of courage but desperation to do something good again. Since then, he'd remained, always just out of reach, a silent guardian in the trees, but never this close, never inside. Until now. "Bruno," she whispered, but he didn't flinch. His attention was fixed on the door, his breathing slow and sure. A moment later, the latch cracked. The door began to splinter. Whoever it was, they weren't giving up. Then Bruno moved. He stepped forward, towering, and let out a roar so thunderous it seemed to shake the nails loose from the walls. It wasn't the sound of fear. It was fury, ancient and territorial. The cabin vibrated. The men outside cursed. Boots scrambled in the snow, retreating fast into the trees. Ellie stayed frozen beneath the table, one hand on the gun, the other trembling against the floorboards. It was over, for now. When she finally emerged, Bruno was at the threshold, his body still, and his head turned toward the dark woods, watching, waiting. The snow swirled behind him in wild spirals. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his flank. "Thank you," she murmured. Bruno said nothing, of course, but he didn't leave. He stayed there all night, unmoving, as if daring the dark to try again. Ellie didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at the table with Claire's old notebook spread before her, the fire casting gold across the pages. Her daughter's handwriting looped in hurried strokes, sinkholes forming faster than models predict. Sealed entrances beneath the West Ridge. Unmarked access roads. Corporate vehicles. Too much risk. She flipped to the back of the journal. Taped, there was a crude sketch, a map of the forest with a circle drawn in red. Greystone Falls. Go when it's cold. Frozen Vale hides the mine mouth. Ellie touched the ink, her breath catching in her throat. All these years, and she'd never seen this. Claire hadn't just been worried. She'd been hunted. And now they were hunting again. At dawn, Ellie dressed in her old hiking gear. She loaded a pack with supplies, strapped the revolver to her hip, and laced her boots tight. Outside, Bruno still stood by the trees, snow clinging to his thick coat. She approached him slowly, unsure if the bond still held. But when she stepped past him toward the trail, he followed without sound. Together they moved through the knee-deep snow, Ellie relying on her cane and memory, Bruno breaking the path ahead like a living snowplow. They reached the edge of the frozen stream by noon. Sunlight filtered weakly through the gray clouds, and the wind had settled to a tired sigh. The falls ahead glittered like glass, a frozen curtain shielding the rock face behind. Ellie remembered coming here with Claire in the summers, the sound of rushing water so loud they had to shout to be heard. Now it was eerily silent. She stepped closer. Behind the ice, just where the sketch had shown, was a faint outline. A door. No, an entrance. Sealed with stone, covered by time and frost. Her breath hitched. Claire had found it. And now, so had she. She pressed her hand to the ice. Cold seeped through her glove and into her skin. A tremor moved through her. Not from the chill, but from something else. A knowing Claire had died for this place. For the truth buried beneath their feet. And Ellie, old and tired as she was, would dig it up. Not for vengeance, not even for justice, but for the voice silenced in that crash, for the truth her daughter had given her life to protect. She turned to Bruno. "We're not done yet," she said. And Bruno, silent as the mountain, stood beside her like he always had. They would face the storm together. And this time she would not run. The snow deepened as they moved, blanketing the earth in white silence. A hush that seemed to hold its breath with every step Ellie and Bruno took. The forest narrowed here, the trees huddled close together like old friends guarding secrets. Ellie's breath came in short puffs, her lungs not what they used to be, and her knees protested every incline. But she pressed on. The old trail to Greystone Falls, once so familiar during spring hikes with Claire, was now barely visible beneath the drift. Bruno moved ahead, his weight leaving massive prints in the snow, carving a path she could follow. His movements were slow but sure, every few steps glancing back to check on her, those dark, intelligent eyes flicking with silent reassurance. Ellie had never understood how or why Bruno had stayed all these years, but she had stopped questioning it. In a world that had taken so much, some loyalties needed no explanation. She clutched Claire's notebook in one hand, its edges worn soft with years of rereading, and the other gripped the cane she'd fashioned from a young pine the first winter after the accident. It grounded her, steadied her as the wind picked up again, whispering between the branches with a sound that could almost be mistaken for a voice. Claire's voice. "Look here, Mom. See that sediment layer? It's wrong for this region. It's been tampered with." She could almost hear her daughter's excitement, that fervor that had once lit up her entire face like lantern fire. The closer they came to the frozen falls, the more vivid the memories became. Claire had believed in this forest, not just for its beauty, but its bones, its secrets. And Ellie could feel them now, the weight of something hidden pressing down through the snow and soil like an echo too long ignored. They reached the base of Greystone by early afternoon. The falls had frozen solid, a sheer wall of crystalline silence hanging from the rock like a curtain of glass. Ellie stepped close, placing her gloved hand against the ice, tracing the faint outline visible only in this light. An arch cut unnaturally into the rock face, just like Claire's drawing. It was taller than she remembered, almost 2 full Ellie's high, and it had been carefully hidden behind natural stone and plant growth. But now, with the frieze clinging tight, then the deception peeled back like skin under frost. She dropped to one knee and began clearing snow from the base. Bruno helped in his way, sniffing the edges, pacing a tight circle with a low grumble. Ellie felt it too, the wrongness. A stillness beneath the ice that felt more like a tomb than a cave. With trembling fingers, she pulled a small hatchet from her pack and began to chip. The sound echoed sharp against the walls, each strike like a bell tolling the forest awake. Eventually, the ice gave way in chunks, revealing an old steel door hidden beneath a layer of stone and rust. A locking mechanism, half buried and corroded. She tried it, stuck. But then she remembered Claire's note. Old keys don't always turn locks. Sometimes they're just leverage. Ellie braced her cane into the crook of the mechanism and pushed, muscles straining with age and grief and sheer stubbornness. There was a groan of metal, then a snap. The door creaked inward, opening into blackness thick as pitch. A gust of stale air rushed out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of earth, mold, and something older. Time itself. She clicked on her flashlight and stepped inside, Bruno following with a grunt, his massive frame barely fitting through the narrow entrance. The air was heavy, each breath thick with dust and silence. The tunnel sloped gently down, its walls rough with tool marks and ancient support beams that groaned with even their quietest movement. Ellie kept the flashlight low, its beams sweeping over old mining carts, broken rails, and scattered tools coated in frost and rot. Symbols marked the stone, geological notations, some of them Claire's handwriting. She knelt beside one with her daughter's initials and the date, 3 days before her death. Ellie's heart clenched. Claire had been here, and she hadn't just guessed. She'd known. Further in, they found what Claire must have died for, shelves of documents, water-warped but salvageable, boxes filled with rock core samples and unregistered surveys. On a wooden workbench sat Claire's old recorder and a notebook, the leather one she had always carried. Ellie opened it with shaking hands. The last entry stopped her breath. Mercer isn't just funding the dig. He owns the land through shell companies. If anything happens to me, look at the back tunnel. There's a secondary vein, and something they don't want anyone to find. Mercer. Ellie's hands tightened on the leather. Gavin Reed wasn't Reed at all. He was Daniel Mercer, the name Claire had whispered on their last call, too afraid to say aloud. He'd come to the cabin, asking about maps, the land's history, feigning distant relation. But Ellie had felt it even then, a shadow behind his smile. She looked at Bruno, who watched her as if he too understood what they'd found. Then outside the mine, a noise, distant, muffled, voices. Ellie turned off the flashlight. Bruno stood instantly, nose high, ears twitching. Someone was coming. Ellie shoved the notebook and Claire's evidence into her pack and motioned silently. They backed into the mine's mouth just as 2 figures broke through the snow beyond the falls. Armed, one of them, Mercer. No pretense now, no fake smile, just a hunter's focus, scanning for signs of movement. Ellie crouched low beside a barrel, Bruno pressed to the wall behind her, every muscle coiled. Mercer's voice floated in, distorted by ice and wind. She's been here, footprints, clear as day. Find her. The second man, younger and impatient, stepped ahead. Why not just collapse the mine? She's old, she won't last out here. Because, Mercer said coldly, I need to know what she found, before the feds do. Ellie's breath caught. They were close, too close. Then without warning, Bruno surged forward with a roar that shattered the frozen air. He barreled through the entrance like a freight train, scattering snow and panic. The younger man screamed and fell, his rifle lost in the snow. Mercer raised his weapon, but Bruno was already on him, his weight knocking the man off his feet. Ellie ran then, not away, but forward, toward the men. She grabbed the fallen rifle, aimed it with trembling hands and shouted, "Enough!" The sound of her voice cut through the chaos. Mercer froze beneath Bruno's massive paw, blood seeping from a gash on his shoulder. But before Ellie could fire, the wind shifted. And from the trees came a sound stranger than gunfire or bear roars, a rhythmic, broken static. The old ham radio clipped to Ellie's belt crackled to life. Voices, human ones, dispatch codes, search units. The signal she'd sent from her cabin days ago had finally been heard. And then, the trees moved. Not the wind, not illusion. Bears, a dozen of them, stepping from the pines with eerie calm. They didn't growl or charge. They stood in a wide circle around the cabin clearing, eyes fixed on the men, silent as spirits. Mercer went pale, his body slack with disbelief. The second man sobbed. Ellie stood taller, rifle in hand, Bruno beside her like a king returned. And then, sirens. Faint but rising, winding up the trail, flashing blue slicing through the snow. The law at last. Officers flooded the clearing minutes later, weapons drawn but hesitating when they saw the strange tableau. A woman with wild white hair, a bloodied bear towering beside her, two armed men surrounded by quiet watching giants. Ellie lowered the gun slowly, her knees finally giving way. But Bruno caught her. Just a nudge. Just enough. Then darkness claimed her, not fear, not defeat, but release. The fight was over. For now. Claire, she thought, wherever you are, we made it. The scent of antiseptic lingered faintly in the warm cabin air, mingling with the wood smoke from the hearth and the scent of pine that drifted through the slightly cracked window. Ellie lay on the old sofa beneath a woven quilt, blinking into the golden light of morning. Her body ached in a dozen quiet places, and her head throbbed with the weight of exhaustion. But she was alive. They all were. Across the room, nestled beside the fire, Bruno rested with one massive paw bandaged in thick white gauze. He slept deeply, his breath heavy and rhythmic, rising and falling like a metronome of peace. His flank had been cleaned and stitched with trembling care by one of the officers, an old hunter turned forest ranger named Joe Hartwell, who had arrived with the first wave of responders. Hartwell had recognized Bruno immediately, remembered whispers of the silent bear that watched the ridge, and hadn't hesitated to kneel beside him. He's not just a bear, Hartwell had said. He's part of this forest. Ellie believed him. She always had. She shifted slightly, wincing as her ribs reminded her she was no longer a young woman. Her eyes drifted toward the kitchen table where Claire's journal sat open, its pages now stained by snowmelt, fingerprints, and the urgency of the last few days. It had survived the confrontation, just like she had, just like the truth had. Outside, the sound of boots on snow crunched softly as a pair of agents from the U.S. Department of the Interior patrolled the perimeter, their radios murmuring intermittent updates. Since Mercer's arrest 2 days ago, Ellie's cabin had transformed into something between an evidence bunker and a sanctuary. The documents retrieved from the mine, including Claire's geological maps and voice recorder, had blown the case wide open. Federal officials had wasted no time initiating a multi-agency probe. A sealed corridor beneath Greystone had revealed a secondary chamber with illegal mineral extraction tools. Years old, undisturbed until Ellie's flashlight had touched them. Ellie closed her eyes again, letting the quiet fill her chest. But the quiet didn't last. A gentle knock on the door pulled her from the edge of sleep. She sat up slowly, her joints stiff with effort, and called out, "Come in!" The door creaked open, and Agent Maris, a wiry woman with graying hair and sharp, clear eyes, stepped inside. She carried a thermos in one hand and a folder in the other. "Morning, Miss Hayes," she said, offering a smile that managed both professionalism and kindness. "Thought you might like some coffee." Ellie accepted it gratefully, her hands wrapping around the warmth. "Smells like salvation," she muttered, earning a quiet chuckle from Maris, who set the folder down beside the journal. "That's everything we've confirmed so far. Mercer's real estate acquisitions, the offshore accounts, the payments tied to Greystone's shell leases. It's more than enough. He won't see daylight for a long time." Ellie nodded, though the news brought her little satisfaction. Justice wasn't always satisfying. Sometimes it just stopped the bleeding. "What about Claire?" she asked, voice softer now, laced with something more fragile than grief. "Hope." Maris's expression shifted, gentled. "We're reopening the crash investigation. With Mercer in custody and the original coroner already under scrutiny for past misconduct, we expect the full picture to emerge. You were right not to let it go." Ellie looked down into her coffee. "I only wish Claire could see it." She does, Mara said quietly, and then, sensing the moment had stretched too long, added, there's someone here who wants to talk to you. Ellie arched an eyebrow, curious. Maris opened the door wider, and a tall man stepped inside, early 40s with broad shoulders and eyes that carried something of Claire's intensity. Name's Julian Rourke, he said. I was Claire's research partner. We worked together at OSU. Ellie's breath caught. She mentioned you once. Said you were the only one who didn't back down when things got hard. Julian gave a sad smile. She made it easy to be brave. They sat together at the table, the coffee between them cooling slowly. Julian reached into his coat and pulled out a flash drive. These are the digital files Claire uploaded to our lab server before she disappeared. I found them the night well, I was too scared to do anything with them back then. But they belong to you now. Ellie held the tiny drive as if it were a holy relic. She said nothing, only reached over and laid her hand gently over Julian's. Thank you. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the window panes and stirring the trees. Bruno shifted in his sleep, huffing softly. Ellie looked over at him with a mix of affection and awe. He saved me. He's always been there. I don't know how or why, but he knew. He knew when I couldn't even stand. Julian followed her gaze. Maybe Claire had something to do with that. Ellie smiled faintly. Maybe the forest did. The next few days passed in a haze of interviews, cataloging, and briefings. Reporters were kept at bay by the snow and a wall of federal jurisdiction. The story that began to form was staggering. Greystone Falls, once believed to be an untouched reserve, had been siphoned dry in secret for over 15 years. Rare earth minerals. Yes, our share of minerals, critical for tech production, had drawn in greedy developers like Mercer, who buried the operation under layers of forged paperwork and political bribery. Claire had uncovered the seismic irregularities first, then the falsified land records. When she pushed too hard, she was silenced. But her evidence, preserved in ink, voice, and stone, had broken through the frost. Now the nation was watching. And Ellie, once dismissed as a reclusive widow lost to the past, had become something else entirely. A voice, a witness, a guardian. By the end of the week, Greystone was declared under full federal protection, pending designation as a permanent conservation site. The news was delivered to Ellie by a young official who seemed barely old enough to drive, let alone carry the weight of such decisions. But he spoke with reverence, calling her a key figure in ecological justice and thanking her for her unwavering resolve. Ellie didn't respond. She simply asked if they could ensure the wildlife corridors remained intact. The man blinked, then nodded quickly, scribbling it into his notepad as if it were gospel. That night, with the cabin finally quiet again, Ellie stepped outside into the snow. The air was crisp, filled with starlight and the faint scent of pine resin. Bruno stood nearby, healed enough to move but still favoring his right side. He turned to her, and for a long moment, they simply looked at one another. Then Ellie reached up and scratched behind his ear. You're not just a bear, she said. You're part of me now, part of her. Bruno rumbled low in his throat, a sound not of pain, but of understanding. She looked to the trees, to the place where Claire had once stood, and traced the sky with her fingers. I think I'm ready, Ellie whispered. Not to forget, but to speak. The wind answered, soft and cold and carrying something older than grief, something like purpose. Ellie turned back toward the cabin, where the journal, the flash drive, and the future waited. It was time. The forest had held its breath for too long. Now it exhaled, and in its breath lived the story of a woman, a daughter, and a bear. Etched not in legend but in truth. And Ellie Hayes, who once hid beneath a table with nothing but a revolver and memories, now stood as a symbol not just of survival, but of fierce, unyielding love. Tomorrow she would speak. But tonight she stood in the snow, hand resting on the creature who had stood between her and the dark, and whispered her daughter's name to the stars. Claire. Always, still, forever. Ellie stood behind the podium in a modest community hall, tucked into the heart of Portland, her fingers gripping the wooden edges, not out of nervousness, but to steady the storm that brewed inside her. The hall smelled of old varnish and damp wool, filled now with rows of folding chairs occupied by reporters, students, forest rangers, and people who had once doubted her sanity. Cameras blinked in silence. Microphones waited like patient vultures, but she didn't fear them. Not anymore. Behind her on a small screen, the opening image glowed. A scan of Claire's final journal page, the red-circled sketch of Greystone Falls and the words, "If anything happens to me, look beneath the ice." Ellie took a deep breath, one that reached deep into the cracked ribs of memory, and began. "My name is Eleanor Hayes. Most people around North Ridge knew me as the woman who vanished into the woods after my daughter died. Some called me a recluse, some called me crazy. Some, I'm told, wondered if I'd ever come back out. For a long time, I didn't think I would. But I'm here today because silence didn't save Claire. And it won't save the forest she died trying to protect." The room was still. Even the air held its breath. Ellie's voice, weathered, low, firm, cut through the space with a clarity that needed no amplification. "3 years ago, my daughter and her husband were killed in what was called a car accident. But before that, Claire had discovered something beneath Greystone Falls. Illegal mining operations hidden under government silence. She submitted her findings. She asked for protection. And then she was gone." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "For a long time, I lived only with the grief. Then one night someone came looking for what Claire had hidden. Men with guns. And beside me, under my table, stood the only soul I trusted. Bruno." The photo changed. An image of Bruno, his great bulk dusted in snow, standing beside Ellie in front of the cabin. The room stirred. Someone gasped softly. "He's not trained, he's not tamed, but he is loyal. And when those men came, he stood between me and death. That bear, a creature this world would call wild, knew better than most people what loyalty means." Ellie continued, guiding the audience through the maps, the mine, the files, and finally the confrontation. Her voice cracked only once, describing the moment Bruno lunged, not for blood, but for protection. She skipped the part where she had screamed in fear, or how the gun had shaken in her hand. She left out the way Bruno had whimpered as the bullet grazed his shoulder. Some truths belonged to her and the forest alone. By the end, there were tears in the crowd, some hidden, some not. A young woman in the second row whispered something into her sleeve, likely a message to a news desk. A bearded man near the back, in a forest ranger uniform, rubbed his eyes and nodded slowly. Ellie stepped down from the podium, her legs trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer exertion of telling, of remembering, of giving Claire's voice to the world again. The walk back to her seat felt longer than the climb up. But when she reached it, Julian Rourke stood to help her down, steadying her with a touch as gentle as a falling leaf. "You did it," he whispered. "She'd be proud." Ellie smiled faintly. "She is." In the days that followed, the story ignited. News anchors spoke her name with reverence. Social media lit up with images of the cabin, the frozen entrance, and the silhouette of a bear standing a watch beneath the pines. Protesters began gathering at Greystone's boundaries, demanding full federal protection, not just of the mine, but of the entire North Ridge Range. Senators called. Scientists offered partnerships. A conservation fund was started in Claire's name. And Ellie returned home, back to the forest, back to the rhythm she knew. But something had shifted. Her solitude was no longer a shield. It was a platform. Visitors came now, some by snowshoe, others guided by park rangers with trembling awe in their voices. They didn't come to gawk. They came to listen. She told them about the land, about balance, about silence as both friend and enemy. Sometimes she told them about Bruno, who would watch from the tree line, half curious, half protective. He never approached the groups. Only her, only Ellie. Spring came late that year, but when it did, the forest woke like a hymn rising through green cathedral halls. Streams thawed, birds returned, and the bears moved more freely again. Bruno's limp faded slowly, though he never strayed far. He often lay near the cabin during the warmer afternoons, his breath rising like soft smoke from his nose, his ears flicking at the slightest sound. Ellie took to sitting beside him in the evenings, their companionship wordless but rich. Sometimes she read aloud, sections of Claire's writing or letters sent by strangers who had heard her story and felt changed. One came from a girl in Vermont. "I didn't know it was okay to love the wild like that. I thought we were only supposed to fear it. But now I understand, it's family too. One morning, a soft knock at the door pulled Ellie from her reading. She opened it to find a young mother and her daughter, no more than 8, holding a sketch pad. "Is it true," the girl asked, "that you lived with a bear?" Ellie knelt slowly, her knees cracking like dry twigs. "Not lived with," she said with a smile. "But he stayed, and that meant something." The girl showed her the sketch. It was rough, childlike. Bruno standing beneath the trees with a woman at his side. But the emotion was unmistakable. Trust. Courage. Ellie felt her throat tighten. She invited them in, made tea, let the girl ask questions, and even read a page from Claire's journal aloud, letting her daughter's words ripple into a new generation's ears. Later that week, Ellie stood again at the edge of the ridge, staring out across the thawing forest. Below, Greystones shimmered like a hidden promise. Beside her, Bruno rose, stretching with a yawn that seemed to shake his whole frame. She rested a hand on his shoulder, fingers threading gently through the thick fur. "It's changing," she said softly. "The world, maybe not fast, but it is." Bruno didn't respond, but his silence was the same kind of answer it had always been, one born of presence, of trust. She looked skyward. The clouds moved like slow ships across a pale blue sea, and for a moment Ellie imagined Claire's spirit there, gliding between the pines, watching the land she had loved so fiercely, being guarded now by those who finally understood. In the final days of spring, a plaque was placed at Greystone's base, beside the newly established ranger station. It read, "In memory of Dr. Claire Hayes, scientist, guardian, daughter." She listened to the forest, and the forest answered. A second line carved beneath in quieter font. "Dedicated by Eleanor Hayes and the silent guardian of North Ridge." People stopped to read it every day. Some left flowers, others left stones or drawings or letters, and some just stood, letting the wind touch their skin and the cold spray from the thawing falls remind them they were small, yes, but not powerless. Ellie, now in the twilight of her years, spent her days walking the woods with Bruno. Sometimes she still found new corners of the land that Claire had marked in her journals. Little side notes like "moss thicker here" or "pines hold light at dusk." She followed them like breadcrumbs, like blessings. She never claimed the forest. She didn't need to. It had claimed her long ago. When asked later in a televised interview filmed from her porch what she hoped people took from her story, Ellie had paused only briefly. "I hope they remember that love isn't just what you say. It's what you stand beside." Claire loved this land, and I loved her. So I stood. Bruno, he didn't owe me anything, but he stood too. That's how you know something's worth saving. When even the wind answers the call. The camera lingered on her face, lined and strong, then panned to Bruno dozing under the trees, the sun catching on the curve of his shoulder like a golden brand. Ellie reached down to her side, where Claire's journal rested open beside her. The wind flipped a page, revealing an old note Claire had scribbled in the margin. "If ever we forget the forest can speak, we forget who we are." Ellie smiled faintly. "I remember," she whispered. And somewhere deep in the woods, a distant roar answered, not of fear, but of memory, of bond, of belonging. The story had ended, but the forest always had more to say. In the heart of early summer, the forest no longer whispered, it sang. A low, lush chorus of life unfurled through the trees, bees thick with pollen tracing invisible lines through the air, saplings stretching skyward with bold green fingers, and somewhere deeper in the brush, the laughter of water slipping over stone. The snow had long melted, revealing trails softened with machias and damp earth. Ellie walked slowly now, a carved wooden staff replacing her old cane, her pace deliberate but steady. She followed no marked path. She didn't need one. Her feet knew this land as intimately as her hands once knew Claire's hair when she braided it on Sunday mornings, or the warmth of a child's forehead pressed to her shoulder in sleep. Bruno ambled beside her, his great body moving with a grace that belied its mass. His injured shoulder healed, though he still limped when the weather shifted. They moved together through the underbrush like a story already half told. Each step an unwritten sentence, each breath a quiet punctuation. They were headed toward a clearing that had only recently been given a name, Hayes Hollow. It wasn't official. No plaques marked the space, no fences defined its border. But the community knew. Rangers whispered it with reverence, and visitors left trinkets at its edge. Stones shaped like hearts, small carved bears, feathers, pressed flowers wrapped in twine. It had become a place of pause, of memory, a place where people came not to take, but to listen. When Ellie reached the hollow, she paused at its threshold, one hand resting against the bark of a young cedar. The sunlight streamed down in long shafts, catching the motes in the air like stars trapped in daylight. In the center stood a circle of low stones laid there by Julian and the park volunteers in the weeks after Mercer's sentencing. It was quiet now, but not empty. No space like this ever was. Ellie stepped forward, brushing her fingers against the tops of the stones. She remembered the day she'd first returned here, back when the forest was still raw with memory, when she couldn't hear birdsong without it feeling like a eulogy. She had knelt here and wept until her tears mixed with the soil. But today, there were no tears, only a soft warmth in her chest, like the embers of a long-burning fire. Bruno settled near the edge of the hollow, his body half in shadow, half in sun. Ellie lowered herself onto one of the flat stones and opened the notebook she now carried always. A leather-bound journal filled not with maps or evidence, but reflections. Pieces of Claire, pieces of herself. Letters never sent, thoughts never spoken. She flipped to the latest page and began to write. "Dear Claire," she wrote, the pen scratching gently. "The world is changing. Slowly, yes, but it is. They've closed the mine. Your work has made its way into classrooms. I met a young girl last week, Tessa. She knew your name. She wants to be an environmental geologist. I asked her why, and she said, because someone has to stand where it's hardest. I thought you'd like that." She paused, her eyes lifting to the treetops, where sunlight flickered through leaves like messages in code. "I still feel you here," she whispered, "especially in the quiet. Especially when the wind moves in that particular way, the way it used to when we'd camp up by the falls and you'd tell me about tectonic shifts and sediment records like they were bedtime stories." Her throat tightened, but she didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a while, not because the grief had gone, but because it had found its place. A companion, not a burden. A reminder. She closed the journal and looked at Bruno. He raised his head slightly, as if acknowledging her glance. "It's been nearly a year," she said aloud, "since that night, since you stood between me and the men who thought fear could bury the truth." Bruno grunted softly, shifting his weight, his ears flicking at the sound of a woodpecker tapping somewhere in the trees. "You taught them something," she added, "not just about but about loyalty, about what it means to protect what matters, even if you can't explain it in words." The bear huffed again, this time with a sound that felt like agreement. Ellie chuckled, the sound rich and alive. "You're still not my pet," she said, "but you're my family." She stood slowly, bones creaking, and walked to where Bruno lay. She knelt beside him and placed one hand against his broad, warm shoulder. "You've done enough, old friend," she said. "You can rest now, if you want. I'll keep walking for both of us." Bruno looked at her with those deep, dark eyes, then leaned his head into her palm. It was the only answer she needed. That night, back into the cabin, Ellie sat by the fire and listened to the ham radio crackle. She no longer sent distress calls. Instead, she sent stories. Once a week, she'd tune in and read one of Claire's entries, or a passage from a student who had been inspired by her work, or even a journal entry from her own heart. It had become something of a ritual, a forest broadcast, reaching anyone who chose to listen. One night, a ranger from New Mexico replied. Another night, a pair of siblings camping in Montana sent back a message in Morse. "Thank you, you reminded us we're not alone." Ellie smiled at the memory. The radio had once been a lifeline. Now it was a lantern, lighting the way for others. The forest, too, had changed. Greystone's surrounding lands were now a research preserve. Julian had taken a position as director, ensuring that Claire's models were implemented and taught. He visited often, bringing with him wildflower seeds and news from the outside world. Sometimes he brought students. Always he asked Ellie's permission. She always said yes. Claire would have wanted it that way. As summer thickened and the sun lingered longer each evening, Ellie began work on something new. A book. Not a scientific report, not a manifesto, just a story. Her story. Claire's. Bruno's. She called it When the Forest Answers. The title came from something she had once whispered in a moment of exhausted gratitude. If you love something enough, even the forest answers. She wrote late into the night, pausing only when Bruno rose and nosed her hand, reminding her to rest. But it felt urgent, not rushed, just necessary, as if the forest itself wanted the story told while she still had the breath to tell it. And so she did, in her own voice, without polish, without apology, just truth. On the first day of fall, Ellie walked back to Hayes Hollow. She carried with her a copy of the finished manuscript, bound in rough canvas and tied with twine. She placed it on the center stone, beneath a smooth river rock carved with Claire's initials. She didn't stay long, just long enough to whisper, "I kept my promise." Then she turned and left it there, for the forest to hold. Later that night, a breeze rose through the hollow, lifting the edge of the manuscript and fluttering the pages like a slow applause. An owl called in the distance. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a bear answered. Not Bruno, one of the others. One of the new ones that had begun to appear, drawn perhaps by scent, by story, by the quiet echo of something good. Ellie heard the call from her cabin porch and smiled. The story had traveled. Years later, when Ellie's cabin was finally left quiet and still, when the fire no longer burned and Bruno's prints had faded into soil, the forest kept speaking. Hikers who passed the hollow claimed to feel warmth there, even in winter. Children spoke of a bear they saw at dusk, always watching, but never afraid. And tucked inside the ranger station was a shelf lined with books, the first of which was When the Forest Answers, its cover worn by many hands, its pages stained with fingerprints and love. Inside the front cover, in Ellie's neat, looping script, were 4 words. He wasn't my pet. And beneath that, in a line slightly faded by time, another. He was my family. And sometimes, if the wind shifted just right and you stood very still, you could almost hear her voice again, moving between the trees like sunlight, telling the story, trusting the forest to carry it on. She collapsed in the snow. Then a grizzly bear did the unthinkable. In the remote reaches of Yukon's Whitefall Wilderness, winter settled over the land like a living presence. Snow didn't fall here, it consumed. It swallowed the landscape in silence, buried memories under white drifts, and curled beneath the skin like a slow, patient ghost. For Naomi Clark, that silence was the reason she had come. 32 years old and hollowed out by a heartbreak that refused to name itself, she had left the city behind with little more than a duffel of clothes, her sketchbook, and the ache of a life that no longer felt like hers. She'd driven north until the roads gave up, until the pavement cracked into gravel and then vanished entirely under snow. From there, a pilot in a twin-engine bush plane had dropped her near a ranger station. A snowmobile had carried her the rest of the way, miles from the nearest road, deeper still into Whitefall's grip. Her cabin was a squat, sturdy thing tucked between thick stands of black spruce. It had no internet, no phone, and only a wood stove for heat. But the windows looked out onto the trees, and the nights brought silence so complete it felt holy. Naomi's days fell into a rhythm. Morning tea, crackling fire, heavy boots laced tight. She explored cautiously at first, keeping to familiar trails with her GPS and hand-drawn maps. But soon she began wandering further, her sketchbook tucked beneath her coat, seeking the quiet company of the wilderness. She filled page after page with ink and charcoal, porcupines chewing on bark, moose standing knee-deep in frozen ponds, lynx tracks vanishing into shadow. Yet always her hand returned to one creature, the grizzly. She drew them obsessively, from memory, from ranger field notes, from grainy photos in the old books she'd packed. Their shapes came easier with time, the powerful haunches, the shag of their shoulder fur, the deep-set eyes. But there was one she drew more than any other, a massive male, described by a ranger at the station during her first week in Whitefall. He'd spoken of it offhandedly over coffee by the base camp stove. Big fella, he'd said. Left eye's got a scar like he tangled with a goddamn cougar. Keeps his distance, but he's out there. That bear had taken up residence in her imagination. She sketched him by firelight, added his scar in soft gray strokes, gave him eyes that watched from the page with something like understanding. She called him her silent guardian. He became both real and unreal, something between myth and memory, a shape her soul seemed to recognize. On the 37th day of her retreat, Naomi set out early. The sun was a dim coin behind slate clouds, and her breath hung in the air like fog. She was headed toward a clearing she'd seen the week before, a broad basin cradled by ancient spruce. A ranger had mentioned recent bear tracks there. She couldn't resist. The hike took longer than expected. Snowdrifts blocked parts of the path, forcing her to detour through narrow, uneven terrain. Her muscles burned, but she pressed on, driven by the promise of stillness and sketching. When she reached the clearing, it was breathtaking. Trees circled the space like quiet sentinels, their trunks thick with frost. A silence hung heavy, broken only by the creak of frozen branches and the distant caw of a raven. Naomi dropped to one knee, brushing aside snow until she found the tracks. Wide, unmistakable paw prints pressed deep into the crust. She swallowed hard, then opened her sketchbook, breath fogging the page as she began to draw. The bear came to life beneath her fingers. Broad head, scarred eye, snow clinging to its coat. She lost herself in the lines, the world narrowing to the shape of the animal and the slow rhythm of her pencil. But then, something shifted. The wind, which had been light, suddenly roared to life. Clouds thickened like bruises. Snow began to fall again, fast and sharp, obscuring the trees. Naomi stood quickly, slipping her sketchbook into her coat, heart beating faster now. She turned toward the path, but the clearing was already dissolving into white. The storm had come from nowhere. Within minutes, visibility vanished. Trees became shadows. The trail disappeared. She tried to retrace her steps, but the wind howled like a thing alive, battering her body and shoving snow into her eyes, her mouth. Her legs grew heavy. She stumbled, then fell, her hands buried in the drifts. Cold seeped through her gloves, her coat, into the marrow of her bones. She rose again, walked a dozen steps, then another fall. Panic bubbled, but it felt distant. Her fingers began to go numb. After what might have been minutes or an hour, Naomi collapsed again. This time she didn't get up. Her limbs refused. The snow was relentless, building on her back, her legs, as though trying to erase her. She curled into herself, shivering violently. Her thoughts slowed, then flickered, then faded. She closed her eyes. Her last conscious thought was the memory of that scarred bear, the one she'd drawn again and again. She wondered if he'd ever stood in this very clearing, if he was watching now from the shadows. And then there was nothing. But something had been watching. A shape moved through the storm, massive, silent. The bear. It emerged from the trees like a phantom, its coat dusted white, its breath steaming. It paused beside Naomi, lowering its head to sniff her. Then slowly it circled her, lay down beside her, and pressed its body against hers. For hours it stayed, shielding her from the wind with its bulk, its warmth bleeding into her frozen limbs. Naomi did not stir, but her chest imperceptibly continued to rise and fall. Just before dawn, the bear rose. Its breath steamed into the icy air. It looked down at the woman beneath it, this strange, fragile thing whose scent it somehow recognized. Then it turned and walked into the storm. 30 miles away, two park rangers sat at their monitoring station, reviewing camera feeds from storm-triggered alerts. "Outpost 7 just pinged," one of them said. "Nobody should be out there." They clicked into the footage. A grizzly bear stood at the ranger outpost door, not pacing, not sniffing, clawing, growling, roaring. The footage showed no aggression, just desperation, as if it were trying to wake someone inside. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the trees. The rangers exchanged looks. No bear had ever behaved like that. Curious, and more than a little concerned, they set out with snowmobiles as soon as the storm eased. The trail led them into a dense section of whitefall, following the bear's tracks until they reached a drift near a frozen clearing. Something had disturbed the snow recently. They dug and found her. Naomi, unconscious, half buried, her skin pale and lips blue, but alive. Her body temperature was low but stable. She shouldn't have survived the night, but someone had kept her warm. As they loaded her into the sled, one of the rangers spotted something near her chest. A sketchbook, partially exposed. He flipped it open. The last page held a charcoal drawing. A bear, scar over its left eye. They didn't speak for a moment, just stared at the sketch, at the trail, at the clearing where the snow was still warm, slightly packed, like something enormous had lain there through the storm. A presence, a breath, a life. And somewhere deep in the trees, a shadow moved, watching, then turned and was gone. The cabin was a blur of warmth and motion. Naomi floated in and out of awareness, her body swaddled in blankets, her skin stinging from heat after so long in the cold. She heard voices first, low, firm, steady, a woman asking her name, a man saying they had almost missed her, that another hour in the snow would have been too late. Naomi couldn't respond, her lips barely moved. But inside her, somewhere deep beneath the fog, a single thought pulsed: the bear. When full consciousness returned, it came slowly, like thawing ice. Naomi opened her eyes to see a pine-paneled ceiling, a humming heater, the outline of a ranger's badge in soft light. It was a station, a field cabin, repurposed for emergencies. She lay on a cot layered in sleeping bags. The air smelled of antiseptic, wool, and campfire smoke. "You're lucky," the woman ranger said, sitting beside her. "Really lucky. That storm was brutal. We saw the alert from Outpost 7, and when we checked the camera footage—" She paused, her expression unreadable. Naomi blinked, her mouth too dry to speak. The ranger smiled slightly and handed her a bottle of water, tipping it gently against her lips. "Take it slow. You've been unconscious for almost a full day." Naomi sipped. It tasted like snowmelt and metal, but it steadied her. She managed a whisper. "The bear." The ranger's eyes sharpened. "What about the bear?" Naomi tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled. She remembered the wind, the collapse, the weight beside her, the warmth that saved her. "It was there," she rasped. "It stayed with me." The ranger didn't respond for a moment. Then she stood and motioned to her colleague. He entered the room holding a tablet, already cued to a security video. He set it on the edge of the cot. "We saw something we didn't quite believe," he said. "But after finding you where we did, maybe it's not so unbelievable anymore." He pressed play. Naomi watched. The footage was grainy, black and white. It showed the front of a ranger outpost, one long shuttered for winter. A grizzly bear appeared from the trees, moving with urgency, not the slow, loping steps of a forager, but purposeful, focused. It walked right to the door, reared up, and began clawing, not tearing or attacking, but pounding like it wanted someone to answer. It dropped to all fours, roared once, turned, and disappeared. Naomi stared, her throat closed. "That's him," she whispered. "That's the bear I drew." The rangers exchanged glances. "We thought you might say that," the woman replied quietly. "And we found this." She held up Naomi's sketchbook, open to the final page. There, drawn in smudged charcoal, was the bear. Broad chest, powerful shoulders, and a single long scar slashing across its left eye. Naomi reached for the sketchbook with trembling fingers. The image stared back at her like a mirror. She had drawn him again and again, had imagined his eyes watching from the trees, but he hadn't just lived in her imagination. He had been real, had found her, had saved her. The next few days blurred together in warmth and sleep. Naomi's body fought its way back from the edge, fueled by broth, tea, and thick socks someone had lent her. The rangers, Lena and Jared, kept a respectful distance, checking her vitals, offering calm conversation. But the story of what happened, what might have happened, hung in the room like wood smoke. No one wanted to name it. On the third day, Naomi stood shakily by the window of the ranger cabin and watched the snow fall in soft spirals. Her body was weak, but her mind had never felt sharper. Her hand drifted to her sketchbook, where the scarred bear still waited on the page. She needed to go back. Not yet. Her legs couldn't take her half a mile. But soon, she needed to see the clearing again, to feel what had passed between them, because it hadn't been just instinct or coincidence. Something in the bear had recognized something in her, an emptiness, a longing, a kind of sorrow that only the wild seemed to understand. When she was well enough to travel, she returned to her cabin under escort. The snow had deepened, her roof held 3 feet of powder, but her firewood was dry, and her hearth crackled to life as if it had never gone cold. Naomi moved through the familiar space like someone returning to a dream. The pencils on her desk, the stacks of paper, the pine cones she had arranged along the sill, all untouched. The storm had swept the land clean, but inside her little cabin, her life waited patiently. That night, wrapped in blankets with the fire painting gold on the ceiling, Naomi closed her eyes and dreamed of the bear. Not threatening or distant, but close, present, warm. She felt again the weight of his body against hers, the deep rise and fall of his breathing. It wasn't memory, it was something more elemental, a knowing that went deeper than language. The next morning she began to sketch again, not from imagination this time, but from a place of truth. She drew the clearing, the snow falling like ash. She drew herself, curled and fragile, and beside her the bear, not fearsome but steady, a figure of myth and mercy. She worked for hours, her fingers blackened with charcoal, her mind quiet and focused. When she finished, she stared at the page. This wasn't just survival, it was a story, a crossing of paths, a brush between two beings who had no reason to find each other, but who had, against the odds, shared a night and saved a life. A week later, when she returned to town for supplies, Naomi showed the rangers her sketches. They offered to release the footage. She hesitated. The bear was a mystery, a gift. She didn't want it cheapened by media frenzy, but then she saw what it could mean, the chance to protect Whitefall, to keep this land wild and sacred. Release it, she said. Let people see what wildness is capable of. The video went viral in days. News outlets ran it with breathless headlines. Grizzly tries to save human. Yukon miracle. The bear that knocked. Most dismissed it as coincidence, a fluke. Bears didn't help people. But the footage said otherwise. So did Naomi's drawings, her story, her still healing body, her quiet certainty. She held an art show in Whitehorse 2 months later. It was small, but the gallery overflowed. Her sketches hung in quiet reverence, dozens of images of bears, forests, storms, and the woman who had nearly become a ghost. At the center of it all was the final portrait, the scarred bear, eyes forward, not fierce, but fierce with understanding. The show sparked something. Letters poured in, children sent drawings, wildlife organizations rallied. In time, under public pressure and a growing wave of support, the province designated the Whitefall Corridor a protected zone. Naomi didn't seek recognition. She had come to the forest to disappear. Instead, she had been found, saved, reclaimed by something older than language, something that breathed with frost and thundered through the trees on padded feet. The bear was never seen again, not by rangers, not on camera. But Naomi knew he was out there. The forest was his, and once a year, on the anniversary of that storm, she returned to the clearing. She packed lightly, just her sketchbook, a thermos of tea, and her easel. She set it up where the snow still held a faint depression, long faded but never forgotten. She didn't speak, she just sketched. And when the wind began to rise, and the trees whispered in their ancient tongue, she listened. Because sometimes, if she was still enough, and the air just right, she could swear she heard it. Soft, steady, unmistakable. A knock. The spring thaw came slowly to Whitefall, reluctant and shy, like a secret being told one word at a time. The snow receded in thin veins, revealing the black bones of trees and the damp glimmer of half-frozen streams. Naomi stayed through the melt, unwilling to leave, unwilling to turn her back on the land that had rewritten her story in a single night. Each morning she stepped outside with her sketchbook in hand, her boots crunching on crusted snow, and listened. The forest was quieter now, no blizzards, no howling winds. But the silence felt different. Not empty, but full of breath and watching eyes. She'd grown attuned to it, the rhythm of the land. Her senses, once dulled by city noise and heartbreak, now danced to the hush of falling snow and the shift of shadows between trees. There were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when she felt something just beyond sight. A ripple in the underbrush, a pause in the birdsong, a presence. The bear had not returned, not visibly, but she no longer expected him to. What had passed between them was not something that could be summoned. It had been a singular exchange, a grace, a flicker of connection so raw and pure that trying to chase it would only diminish it. Still, she left small offerings near the clearing, A cluster of berries, a painted stone, a poem scribbled on birch bark and tied with twine to a tree branch. Thank you, she wrote in different forms. I remember. I won't forget. By mid-April, the forest came alive again. Buds pushed through the snow-slick bark, and birds returned, filling the air with tentative melodies. Naomi's energy returned in tandem. Her cheeks held color again. Her steps grew longer, stronger, and her hands, once numb and tentative, danced freely across the pages of her sketchbook. She had begun working on a new series, titled Simply Witness. Each piece captured fragments of the storm, but not as she had lived it. These were dreamlike renderings, more feeling than form. A curled human figure against a backdrop of swirling white, a shadow with a scarred eye looming like a question behind the trees, a set of paw prints dissolving into mist. She poured herself into the art with a quiet desperation, as though giving shape to those moments would anchor them in time, would make them real even after memory faded. But life beyond the wilderness didn't stop. Emails came, gallery requests, invitations to interviews. A documentary filmmaker reached out, offering to fly in with a crew, but Naomi declined. She didn't want the bear's story turned into spectacle. This wasn't for cameras and narration. It belonged to the trees, to the snow, to something wordless and wild. Still, there were voices she couldn't ignore. One was her sister, Kara, calling from Vancouver with a voice both relieved and anxious. You nearly died, Nye, she said. Do you understand that? You were buried in snow. A bear shouldn't have been the one to save you. I should have been there. Someone should have. Naomi smiled softly at the phone, sitting on the front step of her cabin with steam rising from her tea. I don't think it works that way, she said. I needed to be lost. I didn't know it, but I did. And I needed him. There was silence on the other end, then Kara's voice again, quieter. Do you think you'll ever see it again? Naomi looked up at the tree line where the wind teased the tips of the spruce. No, she whispered, but that's not the point. Some things happen once. That's enough. May arrived with bursts of green, and with it, the end of Naomi's lease on the cabin. The Ranger Service had allowed her to extend her stay as long as it was safe. But now, with the thaw in full swing and the bears stirring from hibernation, visitors were discouraged from remaining deep in the backcountry. It was time to return. Not permanently, she told herself, just for a while. Just to share the story. Just to bring the drawings to those who had followed her work for years, who had seen the transformation in her lines and shadows and wanted to understand what had changed. She packed slowly, deliberately. Each item folded and placed in her duffel felt like a farewell. Her fingers lingered on the windowsill where pine needles had gathered, on the chipped enamel kettle that had boiled her water each day, on the coat she'd worn the night of the storm, still faintly bearing the scent of snow and cedar. She left one final sketch tacked to the inside of the cabin door. A bear, curled beside a sleeping woman, the wind swirling around them in quiet devotion. Below it, she scrawled a single line. When the world went silent, you stayed. Back in Whitehorse, she found herself adrift in noise again. Car horns, coffee machines, voices rising and falling in crowded cafes. She had grown soft to this world, her edges shaped by wind and snow, and now everything felt too loud, too fast. Still, the gallery welcomed her like a returning myth. The Bear That Knocked was the name they chose. Cheesy, yes, but marketable. The footage from the outpost had become a permanent installation, looping on a small screen beside her most well-known pieces. But it wasn't the video that drew gasps, it was the portrait. 6 feet tall, nearly life-size, charcoal and ink on a stretched canvas that smelled faintly of pine resin. The bear stared out from the frame with eyes that seemed to see past glass and flesh. People stood in front of it for minutes, silent, some in tears. Naomi watched them from a quiet corner, feeling like a ghost within her own body. She wanted to whisper, "He's not gone. He's out there, he's watching." After the show, donations flooded in, money for wildlife preservation, letters from children, notes from people who had once feared bears and now dreamed of seeing one. It was overwhelming. She gave interviews reluctantly, always telling the same story: the hike, the collapse, the warmth in the night, the paw prints in the snow, the ranger footage, the sketch. But she never told it everything. Not the way his breathing had soothed hers, not the moment her fingers curled unconsciously into his fur, mistaking him for a memory of someone she had once loved. Those details were hers and the forest's. Summer passed, then fall, and when the leaves began to turn and the air smelled of frost again, Naomi returned. Just for a few days, she told the rangers. Just to visit. They let her stay in a shelter closer to the clearing, under the condition that she check in via radio twice a day. The path had changed since spring. Wind had danged some trees and the undergrowth had thickened in places, but she found the clearing easily. Her breath caught when she saw it, almost untouched. The same basin ringed by silent spruce, the same open space where the snow once tried to swallow her whole. She set up her easel, opened her sketchbook, sat for hours without drawing, just listening. That night she slept beneath the stars in a weatherproof sleeping bag, her fire crackling low, her mind drifting. The wind picked up around 2 a.m. and for a moment she thought she heard something, a soft thump like weight shifting on frozen ground. Her breath stilled, her ears strained, but the sound did not return. Still she smiled, she understood now. The bear wasn't something to see again. He had already given her everything he could. His presence wasn't tied to a shape or a roar or a paw print in the snow. It was in the hush between heartbeats, in the courage to keep breathing, in the space she had carved in her soul for something greater than herself. At dawn, she packed her things. Before leaving the clearing, she walked to the center and knelt. She pressed her hand to the ground, palm flat against the earth still cold from the night. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm still here." The wind shifted, the trees rustled. Somewhere far off, a raven called into the morning. Naomi rose, her sketchbook tucked beneath her arm, her steps light as she walked back toward the trail. The clearing behind her was empty, but not forgotten. Autumn bled into winter with a grace that only the Yukon could conjure. Quiet, inevitable, bone deep. Frost began to trace the edges of the windows again, and the trees, stripped bare, reached their limbs toward the pale sky as though remembering the weight of snow. Naomi returned to the city in body, but not in spirit. Her days were filled with the rustle of gallery brochures, the buzz of quiet fame, and the constant stream of messages that came to her inbox with phrases like miraculous, life-altering, a symbol of coexistence. She answered what she could, gently and with care, but she remained guarded, protective of the story that had become a myth in the mouths of others. They wanted more. More of the bear, more of the storm, more of the impossible moment that had spared her from death. But Naomi knew that to give everything would be to lose it. She had kept one piece untouched, the drawing she made the morning after the storm, the very first image she had sketched upon waking. It wasn't perfect, it was rough, trembling, barely finished. But it carried a rawness that none of her later works could replicate. The lines weren't just charcoal, they were memory, pulse, breath. She kept it tucked away in a drawer, folded between 2 pages of an old poetry journal, unread by anyone else. The city dulled her, but it also offered the small comforts of normalcy. She taught a few classes at a local art studio, mostly children, bright-eyed, sticky-fingered dreamers who didn't ask questions about the bear, but instead drew their own versions. Rainbow-colored grizzlies wearing scarves, smiling beasts holding lanterns. She laughed with them, even as something in her heart ached for the silent snow. Sometimes she would walk to the edge of town where the buildings thinned and the land opened into fields and forgotten trails. And she would just stand there, coat wrapped airtight, sketchbook clutched under one arm, and listen. But there was no wind like White Falls, no trees that whispered secrets, just cars in the distance, and the brittle rustle of city leaves. She told herself she would return next year, maybe for a month, maybe longer. But when winter arrived in full, a sharp snap of cold, a sky the color of steel, Naomi knew she wouldn't wait. She made the arrangements quietly. A few calls to the ranger station, a permit granted with curiosity and caution. "It's early," Jared said over the phone. "The real snows haven't hit yet, but you know how fast that can change." Naomi smiled faintly. "I know, that's part of why I'm coming." She packed light, winter gear, sketching supplies, a small tin of tea leaves, and the drawing, the first one, carefully rolled and placed in a waterproof tube. She said nothing to the press, told only Kara, who paused on the other end of the line and asked softly, "Do you think he'll be there?" Naomi didn't answer right away. "I think," she said finally, "he's always there, whether I see him or not." The flight into Whitefall was smooth, the pilot quiet, the small plane rattling like a memory through the clouds. When they landed near the ranger station, Naomi stepped out into air that bit at her cheeks and filled her lungs with something she hadn't felt since the last time she was here. Truth. Raw and clean and undeniable. Jared met her at the edge of the landing strip, wrapped in his familiar fur-lined coat. He gave her a long look, then a quiet nod. "We marked the trail for you," he said. "Same route as last year. Cleared some of the fallen trees. You're good for 3 days. Radio check-in at 8 and 6. If anything changes, call." Naomi thanked him. She was grateful for the structure, but she also knew she wouldn't need it. This wasn't a trek or a challenge. It was a return. The walk to the clearing was longer than she remembered, or perhaps her pace was slower, more reverent. Snow clung in patches along the trail, melting and refreezing in delicate patterns. The forest was quieter than before. No bird song, no rustling animals, just the soft crunch of her boots and the steady thud of her heartbeat. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she stopped. Time folded. The trees stood just as they had, the airway held the same hush and tension, and the center of the space, the place where she had lain, where he had lain beside her, still seemed marked, though the snow had long since vanished and returned again. She set her pack down, opened her easel, and unrolled the drawing. She didn't place it on the canvas. Instead, she carried it to the center of the clearing and knelt. Carefully, she unrolled it and laid it flat on the snow, anchoring it with 4 small stones. Then she sat beside it and waited. Not for him. She didn't expect him to appear like some summoned spirit, but for the wind, for the memory, for the presence that had wrapped itself around her that night and never truly let go. Hours passed. The sun shifted. Shadows stretched long and thin. Naomi drew as she waited, not of the bear, not of herself, but of the clearing itself, the way the light fell. The way the trees leaned slightly inward, as though listening. She didn't speak. She didn't move more than she had to. She simply breathed. That night, she lit a fire near the edge of the clearing and curled into her sleeping bag. The drawing once more rolled and kept near. The stars glittered overhead, scattered across the sky like ashes from another world. Somewhere in the distance, a fox barked. And then, just before she drifted into sleep, a sound. Soft, subtle, a low, heavy exhale like breath meeting cold air. Naomi froze. Her eyes opened, heart suddenly pounding in her throat. The fire still flickered. The clearing was still. But she knew. She didn't rise. She didn't look. She only whispered, "Thank you." Silence followed, and then the faintest crunch of snow. A step, another. Near the tree line, a shadow paused. Her eyes, adjusted now, caught only the shape, a vast, broad form, still as stone, watching. Naomi smiled. She did not cry. She did not speak again. She simply closed her eyes. When morning came, there was no sign of him. No tracks, no movement. Just the wind, the snow, and the warmth still lingering in her chest. She packed up slowly, left no trace, save for a small stone cairn at the center of the clearing, beneath which she placed the original drawing. Not hidden, but not obvious. A gift, a piece of herself left in the place that had given her back to herself. As she walked away, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The clearing would remain, just as it was. The bear would remain, just as he had, and Naomi, heart quiet and full, would carry him wherever she went. Not as myth, not as miracle, but as memory, as truth, as something wild and kind that once, just once, had knocked. The city received her like a tide returning from a long retreat, slow, unhurried, inevitable. Naomi stepped off the train in early December, the cold less sharp than the north, the streets less wild, the sky smudged with gray. She felt the old rhythms tugging at her, the slow pulse of traffic, the drone of background conversations, the scent of roasted chestnuts mixing with exhaust. Life here moved on its own track, indifferent to the sacred hush of the Yukon. And yet, Naomi moved through it differently now. Her steps were slower, more deliberate. She carried herself like someone who had seen something not meant to be seen, who had been granted a story not to tell, but to live by. People still asked her about the bear. Strangers in cafes, gallery visitors, students in her workshops. Some asked with reverence, others with disbelief wrapped in polite curiosity. "Do you think it was really trying to help you?" they'd say, or "It's hard to believe a wild animal would do something like that." Naomi never corrected them. She simply said, "He did," and left it at that. There was no use in convincing those who hadn't felt the heartbeat of the forest, the weight of a breath that wasn't your own, sheltering you from death. The holidays brought noise, light-strung windows, the rush of department store crowds, laughter bouncing down wet sidewalks. But Naomi kept her celebrations quiet. She declined party invitations, let voicemails sit unanswered, and spent her evenings in the small apartment she now called home, sipping tea and sketching by candlelight. Her drawings had changed since Whitefall. They were less focused on the bear now, more on the space he had come from. Trees that leaned like guardians, paths that curved without reason. A woman walking through snow, her face always turned slightly upward, like she was listening to something just beyond the wind. She filled sketchbooks without planning to, the images pouring from her as if her fingers were simply remembering what her heart refused to forget. One night in late January, she received a letter. Not an email, but an envelope. Thick parchment, handwritten script, no return address. Inside was a simple note. "Your story stayed with me. I believe you. Thank you for sharing it with the world." Below the words was a charcoal drawing of a grizzly, childlike in execution, but unmistakably bearing the scar over its left eye. Naomi held the paper to her chest for a long time, something warm unfolding in her rib cage like a thaw. She pinned the drawing beside her desk, next to one of her own early sketches. The two images stared out into the room like echoes. The seasons shifted. Spring came late to the city that year, rain-soaked and hesitant, as though unsure whether to let the light return. Naomi had begun walking every morning again, early before the streets filled, through a stretch of parkland that reminded her vaguely of Whitefall if she squinted and silenced the hum of distant traffic. One morning she paused beneath a pine tree and looked up through the canopy. The light slanted just right. Something inside her stirred. It wasn't a longing, not quite. It was quieter than that. A settling, a knowing. She didn't need to return to the Yukon to be held by it. It was with her now, woven into her marrow. The bear hadn't just shielded her from the storm. He had left something behind, not a scar, but a gift, a way of seeing, of listening, of being, and she carried it forward with every breath. By summer, Naomi had completed a new body of work. The exhibition was titled "The Space Between Footsteps." It featured no bears, no direct references to the storm or the clearing. Instead, it was filled with textures, dense graphite forests, layered white paint scraped like wind against paper, fine lines of ink that suggested motion and stillness at once. At the center of the gallery hung one piece unlike the others. It was stark, just a single charcoal line looping into a wide curve, open-ended, disappearing into blank space. Beneath it, a plaque read, "The moment before turning back." People stood before it for long stretches, as if expecting the line to finish itself, as if the pause meant something only they could understand. Naomi never explained it. Some moments defy translation. That summer, she also returned to teaching, not just children now, but adults too, those seeking something intangible. She spoke of negative space, of the importance of absence, of how the world does its best storytelling when we stop trying to control it. "Your hand doesn't always know the path," she told one class, "but the page remembers." In quiet moments, she still dreamed of the bear. Not the night of the storm, never that directly, but of glimpses. A shadow among trees, a warm weight beside her, eyes like dark windows flickering with recognition. And always, just before waking, a single sound, the soft thud of something heavy against wood. A knock. Each year, on the anniversary of that storm, Naomi returned, not to Whitefall, but to the mountains north of the city, where the air was cleaner and the trees stood farther apart. She'd hike alone, carrying nothing but a sketchbook and a thermos of tea, and she'd find a quiet spot to sit and draw. Not because she was hoping to see him again, but because she still remembered what it felt like to be seen. The fifth anniversary fell on a day of low clouds and distant thunder. Naomi climbed a narrow trail lined with moss-slick stones and paused at a clearing where the trees opened like a breath. She sat for hours, sketching the sky, the trembling grass, the movement of shadows. When the wind picked up, she leaned into it, closed her eyes, and smiled. She had no illusions. The bear was likely long gone, moved on to some distant stretch of wilderness, or returned to the earth in the quiet way that wild things do. But that didn't matter. His story wasn't meant to be a chapter in her life. It had become the spine. Not a miracle, not a legend, but a presence that had realigned her understanding of everything, of trust, of solitude, of what it means to be held without being possessed. When she stood to leave, she placed one final drawing beneath a stone by the tree line. A simple silhouette, a woman sitting beside a bear, both looking forward, both at rest. No fear, no need, just being. She whispered, "Thank you," one more time. Not because she believed he was there to hear it, but because the land remembered. The wind carried it. The world once again knew her name. She walked down the mountain slowly, her footsteps steady, her shadow long. In her pocket, the sketchbook rested like a heartbeat. Behind her, the forest watched, quiet and vast. And somewhere in the silence, so faint she might have imagined it, a sound reached her ears. A knock, not loud, not urgent, just enough. Just enough to let her know. Some stories don't end. They wait. They live in the space between each breath, in the hush before the wind stirs, in the clearing where a life was once spared and a soul returned home.